Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus by Ludwig Wittgenstein. So this little book right here, and it is little, is probably by what I can only describe as an incredible margin, the hardest thing I have ever read in my life. This, I really thought my brain was melting when I was reading this. This was on another level. And I really thought it would be. I went into it fully expecting that. And so that might beg the question, if you thought this was going to be so dense and confounding, then why did you undertake to read it? Well, a couple of reasons. Beyond just my own kind of general amateur interest in philosophy, Ludwig Wittgenstein was something of an interest on the late great Cormac McCarthy, especially there towards the end. And also beyond that, there's another book that I want to read that is in some form or fashion indebted to this. I'll let you see if you can't figure out what book that I might be alluding to there. But anyway, so I wanted to read this. It's considered one of the most revolutionary works of philosophy, certainly of the 20th century, if not just period. So I really wanted to read it and see what I could glean from it. And I will readily admit up front right now, I did not understand a lot of this. Like, a lot of it I did not understand, I'm sure. However, I did understand some of it, I think. Maybe I should say that I am given to understand some of it, although the nature of that understanding may or may not be perfectly correct. But so I will expound upon what I think I understood about it. And again, just prefacing that I might be 100% wrong about certain things or all of it. But I'm going to give it my best shot. So, a little background on this. Ludwig Wittgenstein, you may or may not know, was an Austrian philosopher in the 20th century. He was the son of one of the wealthiest men in Europe, if not just the world over. And he eventually got into philosophy as well as mathematics and kind of the philosophy of mathematics and also the philosophy of language, which this deals with in a major way. And he wrote this book, Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, I believe while he was serving in World War I. And by the way, this is the only work that he published in his lifetime. That's right, his entire reputation kind of rests on this work. Although there have been posthumous things that were published, such as the Philosophical Investigations, in which he kind of recanted certain things about this. However, this is kind of what made his name, I think. And it did so because Wittgenstein intended this to resolve all problems of philosophy. That's right. This was intended to be quite literally the theory of everything when it came to philosophy. Now, that is a remarkably big claim. However, being someone myself who has been known to make rather grandiose statements, I can respect the balls on that. And what's more, it it backs it up, or at least tries to. I'll say, even though the content of this has been certainly contestable since its publication. Let's dive right in to the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. So, um, the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus contains a number of statements and assertions. And I'm not going to go through all of them, obviously, because there's a lot, but also, again, many of them I just don't understand. So I'm just going to kind of restrict myself to speaking on what I can speak on, and whereof I cannot speak, thereof I will remain silent. So, opening the work, Wittgenstein says that the world is all that is the case. The world is composed of facts, not of things. and that the world divides into facts, and that the facts are composed of things rather. So this is just the um, introduction of the logical atomism that Wittgenstein really stood behind. Now, if you don't know what logical atomism is, it's basically the translation of the material world which we inhabit into the logical world which we conceive. This logical world being composed of facts, which are statements about the relations between objects and properties and such. So we start out with logical atomism, and then from there we springboard into a whole lot of other stuff. And this book, despite being very, very brief, is remarkable for its comprehensiveness. This book really does kind of encompass virtually everything, and it is truly astounding to see how it does. Um, the basic gist of Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, as I'm given to understand it, I think, is that language creates an image of reality. Language creates a representation of the world, a map, if you will. However, as we know with maps, the value of a map corresponds to how accurately it portrays, how accurately it reflects the territory which it depicts. And Wittgenstein's thesis with this work is that um, all problems in philosophy have to do with the fact that we don't really know what we're saying a lot of the time. We speak carelessly, and so we often veer into the realm of nonsense. And Wittgenstein's solution here is that as long as we understand what it is that we say and understand how what we say relates to what is the case, there won't be any more problems because again, this was meant to resolve all the problems of philosophy. And now from there we go into the truth tables, and now I want to say here that I have only a very basic foundation of logical instruction. And there in the middle section where we get into the truth tables and such, when it really goes heavily into propositional logic, and you really have to have some kind of knowledge of that in order to get anything out of this. Um, I will say that I think that Wittgenstein is actually the progenitor of the truth tables. Again, I remember doing truth tables in college, not being very good at them, and getting my mind kind of rocked with propositional logic, P's and Q's, that kind of thing. Anyway, so we go into Wittgenstein's assertions about the truth functions of various propositions. I'm not gonna go too much more in depth into that because I did get lost in some of that. But from there, we also go into a lot of discussion about tautologies and contradictions, because this is very kind of important to Wittgenstein's overall, you know, assertion here. And I was familiar to an extent about that. Tautologies are meaningless statements because by saying everything, you essentially say nothing, and obviously contradictions are just nonsensical. But also, from there, we go into much, much deeper waters. And this is where what I'm going to say, I'll say that this is just what I got out of it. This is my take on it, and I may be erroneous in certain things, but again, I'm just giving you what I think it means. So just bear with me. So Wittgenstein asserts that the logical structure of the world can only be shown, it cannot be spoken of in itself. And that is the central issue as he sees it, is the fact that things can only be shown, like it's logically speaking. Again, the logical structure of the world can only be shown, and it cannot be spoken of in itself. That's a hurdle that may be insurmountable. And a way to demonstrate this, I think, is with mathematics, because mathematics is a logical methodology, right? So, like, if I was to ask you to draw me the number 2, or illustrate the number 2, the concept of 2. You could draw 2 lines, you could draw 2 points, you could draw 2 circles, you could draw 2 things. But the point being that the very concept of 2 only exists in relation to things. The like numbers are abstractions, right? And they only become manifest in things. And that is one of the most kind of, again, mind melting things that the Tractatus says, is that logic can only be shown, it can't be spoken of. But that creates a hell of a problem, as you might be able to infer. But from there, he also goes on to kind of just demolish a lot of basically a lot of other philosophy, because Wittgenstein states that as I alluded to with the map territory analogy, a map is only valuable insofar as it accurately reflects the territory which it depicts. Now, what this means is that we can make propositions about the world, we can state things, we can assert things, but those things are only valid if they have a referent fact, if we can correspond them to something that is the case. What Wittgenstein is saying in here is that um, talking outside of what is the case, talking outside of the world, is just talking nonsense, basically. Now, the implications for this are kind of dire, because this precludes a lot. It means that theology, gone, ethics, gone, aesthetics, gone, metaphysics, gone. What this means is that all that you really had from the start is logic, but that logic inherently bears with it certain obstacles that may be insurmountable. Um, and Also, there is in here some rebuttals, I think, to certain Platonic notions in discussing the forms of things, and how these things can only, again, be shown and not, they can't, that is to say that certain qualities and properties are not extricable from the objects which display them. Again, I think there's some, and I'm not going in order throughout this, I'm kind of jumping around, I think, because again, I'm just trying to hit the points that I think I understood. But this does engage, albeit in an implicit way, with certain other philosophers. And again, there is some real rebuttal in here about certain Platonic notions about forms and such, which Wittgenstein is like, no, that's wrong. But also, he goes on to make some very, very unsettling assertions in regards to natural laws. And this also, I think, crosses over with, like, David Hume's The Problem of Induction. Wittgenstein says that we have, in order to speak correctly, in order to philosophize correctly, we have to restrict ourselves to what demonstrably is. And because of that, we make presumptions about things in the world that are not logically sound. That is to say, in regards to natural laws, in particular, like the law of causality, that everything must have a cause, that certain things will predicate certain other things, and that, B follows from A, and so on. But Wittgenstein says those laws don't really exist. They only exist because we impress them onto the world. That is to say, um, again, this kind of I think ties in with the problem of induction in certain ways. We cannot say to a 100% certainty that the sun will rise tomorrow because there's nothing that says that it has to. All the only thing that says that it has to is us. Again, these natural laws are not actually written anywhere except in our minds, and that's again, I think it kind of does tie in with the induction thing because, like, why do we think that the future will resemble the past? Because we observe the future resembling the past, and so it becomes like a logical loop where we don't actually have any justification for saying certain things. And Wittgenstein really points this out and holds this up, and basically says that our parameters for philosophy are much, much narrower than what we had really thought them to be. In that all you really have, again, is logic, um, but that bears with it certain problems. But because logic can only be shown, because it only makes itself manifest in the world, it also can kind of be said to transcend the world. And also, his discussions in this about ethics and such, um, also he asserts transcends the world. That these things that cannot be tangibly corroborated to what is the case exist outside of the world, and so therefore exist outside of our ability to speak rightly about them. So that is kind of the gist, as far as I can give it, of Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. To kind of conclude my probably highly inept analysis or review of this work, I would like to read certain passages from it because a lot of the passages in this really are quite thought provoking, if not just flat out mind melting. So bear with me, I'll have to consult my cellular here to remind myself where these little statements were. So again, just bear with me here. Um, Bear with me, hang on. So the Tractatus is divided into numbered statements with sub-statements which back up the main points. So number 3 in the work reads as follows. The logical picture of the facts is the thought. And then 3.001, an atomic fact is thinkable, which means we can imagine it. 3.01, the totality of true thoughts is a picture of the world. 3.02, the thought contains the possibility of the state of affairs which it thinks. What is thinkable is also possible. 3.03, we cannot think anything unlogical, for otherwise we should have to think unlogically. So the one thing that Wittgenstein rams home in this work is that you cannot think outside of logic. Nothing can be outside of logic. The only impossibilities are those things that contradict logic or defy logic. So if you can conceive it, it is logically valid. And so what he's saying is, if you can think it, it can be. Now that has some really interesting ramifications, I think. But again, it's just fascinating stuff. And now over here, flipping over a few pages, let's see. Oh yes, so in the course of the Tractatus, Wittgenstein engages with certain more traditional philosophical issues through his logical approach. One of those being the concept of free will. And I found what he had to say on the topic very, very fascinating. So at number 5.134, from an elementary proposition, no other can be inferred. 5.135. In no way can an inference be made from the existence of one state of affairs to the existence of another entirely different from it. 5.136. There is no causal nexus which justifies such an inference. 5.1361. The events of the future cannot be inferred from those of the present. Superstition is the belief in the causal nexus. 5.1362. The freedom of the will consists in the fact that future actions cannot be known now. We can only know them if causality were an inner necessity, like that of logical deduction. The connection of knowledge and what is known is that of logical necessity. So, what Wittgenstein is saying is that free will logically is a valid notion to an extent, at least, because what is cannot infer what will be or might be. And what I find really, really intriguing about this is that it corresponds to certain developments in physics as well. So, in the field of quantum mechanics, it is generally held that the future does not exist concretely, that everything just exists in kind of a nebulous cloud of probability, but not, again, concretely. And what I just really, really, really liked is how Wittgenstein is able to use logic to get to the same place, that the future is not set logically. There is no logical argument that you can make to say to a 100% certainty that the future will be this based on what is. Very, very interesting stuff. And then again, flipping over some more, we have Wittgenstein using logic to get into the waters of idealism. Although he uses the word solipsism, I would have used the word idealism, but regardless. So we have here 5.6. The limits of my language mean the limits of my world. 5.61. Logic fills the world. The limits of the world are also its limits. We cannot therefore say in logic, this and this there is in the world, that there is not. For that would apparently presuppose that we exclude certain possibilities, and this cannot be the case, since otherwise logic must get outside the limits of the world. That is, if it could consider these limits from the other side also. What we cannot think, that we cannot think. We cannot therefore say what we cannot think. 5.62. This remark provides a key to the question to what extent solipsism is a truth. In fact, what solipsism means is quite correct, only it cannot be said, but it shows itself. That the world is my world shows itself in the fact that the limits of the language which only I understand, mean the limits of my world. 5.621. The world and life are one. 5.63. I am my world, the microcosm. 5.631. The thinking, presenting subject. There is no such thing. If I wrote a book, The World as I Found It, I should also have therein to report on my body and say which members obey my will and which do not, etc. This then would be a method of isolating the subject, or rather of showing that in an important sense there is no subject. That is to say, of it alone in this book mention could not be made. 5.632. The subject does not belong to the world, but it is a limit of the world. Again, it's getting really heavy into the waters of logical idealism, that you are the limit of the world because it defines itself to you. And so you are the world in a sense. Again, this is where kind of I think the influence of Wittgenstein shows itself in the works of Cormac McCarthy, to an extent at least, because he definitely subscribed. He said that he subscribed, basically admitted to it in those last couple of books, that he considered himself something of an idealist, I believe. And Wittgenstein gets to that place through his logical method. Again, just really, really intriguing stuff. And then we come over here, and we have Wittgenstein approaching the topic of death through logic. And I believe it was Epictetus, maybe I'm attributing that wrongly, but whoever it was that said, death is not to be feared because when we are, death is not, and when death is, we are not. Well, Wittgenstein echoes those sentiments here when he says, number 6.431, as in death too, the world does not change but ceases. And again, that is almost a direct line in The Passenger. There's a character in Cormac McCarthy's book, The Passenger, that says that there is no difference between a person dying and the world ending. Because if you are the world, because the world defines itself to you, then when you end, it ends in effect. So death is kind of the end of the world because it's the end of your world, because it's the end of you. Um, and then we come over here, another page, and we have number 6.44. And this one I really, really love. Not how the world is the mystical, but that it is. And that really is the ultimate question. The question that lies under everything, the question that is at the bedrock of everything, is the question of why there is something rather than nothing. Beyond all questions of God and religion, of science and logic and anything, beyond all questions of epistemology and what have you, at the bottom of everything is the question, why is there something instead of nothing? And that's what Wittgenstein says here. The fact that anything is mystical in and of itself. And that is just, that's gospel, I would say. And then coming over here to the end. Now, what's so interesting here is that the Tractatus kind of wraps up with seemingly one whopper of a paradox. Whenever he says, number 6.54, my propositions are elucidatory in this way. He who understands me finally recognizes them as senseless. When he has climbed out through them, on them, over them, he must, so to speak, throw away the ladder after he has climbed up on it. He must surmount these propositions, then he sees the world rightly, meaning that by its own logic, Wittgenstein's whole work is, or may be, nonsensical or senseless. And so it again, it really throws you for a loop there at the end when it's kind of like, oh, just kidding, don't take any of this like to heart, or seemingly again. So, and then of course we have number 7, which is the final line in the work. Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. And again, I think that speaks for itself. So, Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus by Ludwig Wittgenstein. This, once and more, is probably the hardest thing I have ever read in my life. There's so much of it, I'm sure, that just went right over my head. However, I did, or at least think that I did, understand some of it, and I'm gonna pat myself on the back for that. I don't like to I don't like to be too self-congratulatory a lot of the times, but with this, I feel no shame in doing that. I understood, I think, some of this, um, and I take a certain measure of pride in that fact. But one thing that I will say on the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus is that it should be noted that Wittgenstein later recanted certain of his claims in his posthumous philosophical investigations. And so he did kind of walk it back later. So when you're reading this, you have to, be aware that this might not be quite as impregnable as he portrays it. There may be certain uh, issues that you can take with it, certain things that you can contest. But I will say this, regardless of that, even if this did not ultimately end up being the be-all, end-all thing that Wittgenstein intended it to be, it is still an immeasurably valuable work. In fact, if you were to ask me to compile a list of like the 100 most important written documents, I would say this would have to go on there, seriously. And, as I've grown in perspective over time and come to kind of, have a certain, again, amateur interest in philosophy and realize how important it is, I've also come to realize, and long before reading this, that of the branches of philosophy, logic is, I think, probably the most important, and moreover, logic is the most important thing I think that there is, because it defines what is and is not, and it makes itself manifest through what is and is not. It is quite literally the way that we lay hold of the world. Now, so even if this is, maybe not the ringing success that Wittgenstein intended it to be, it is still an incredibly monumentally important work, and it is a monumental achievement of philosophy, because this thing will make your mind work like you probably didn't know that it could. And again, so much of it probably just went over my head, but what I did get out of it has irrevocably changed me, I think. So even again, if this didn't end up being and doing what Wittgenstein wanted it to be and do, it is still the product of a monstrously keen intellect, taking things quite literally to the absolute limit. And it is commendable, if nothing else. So, to rate Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, I will not give this a letter grade like I do with most books, because I don't think that's fair to it, because there's so much of it that I just didn't grasp. But I will say this. Could I recommend Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus? Yes and no. It's in the public domain, I think, now, so you should be able to read this online without too much trouble if you want. And again, it's pretty short, too. But I will say this. If you've never, been exposed to, logic, like propositional logic, the P's and Q's and stuff, if you've never, learned that, any of it, you're going to have to familiarize yourself with some of it, to get any of this. And I mean, I have just the most basic, foundation of logic, and I was racking my brain reading this, trying to remember all the operator signs to understand the functions and everything. But I'll say that if you don't have any background knowledge about propositional logic, you're going to have to learn some of it in order to understand any of this. It's just prerequisite. But if you do, then I'd say go for it, because this book it's so short, but it encompasses damn near everything. And another thing about it is that this book is distinct because it is so short. It's unique not only because of what it says, but also how it says it. Because philosophy kind of historically kind of can get a bad rap, because a lot of the works of philosophy are like really, really thick, dense, impenetrable books that often are written in very and probably needlessly convoluted ways. The two that really come to mind, right off the bat when people think of philosophers who kind of just write in that word salad, borderline gibberish that kind of turns people away from the field, would be like Hegel and Heidegger. But Wittgenstein wrote this, and it's only like 70 pages long. But like I said, it kind of encompasses everything. But it really makes a case for something that Wittgenstein said, which is what can be said at all can be said clearly. You don't really need, word salad, overly convoluted, circuitous explanations. If you can say it, it can be said clearly. And Wittgenstein kind of did that. Now, the fact that I didn't understand a lot of it has to do with the fact that what he's talking about is of a very, very um, it's very highbrow, I'll say. But what he does say, he says very clearly and succinctly, and so it kind of maybe makes a case for, if it's the old, like, if you can't dazzle them with intelligence, then baffle them with bullshit kind of thing. If what you're writing is so impenetrable that nobody understands it, well, that's probably maybe your fault, not theirs. But anyway, so I could recommend this. I think this is just, again, probably one of the most important things ever written, even if it's not quite as definitive as Wittgenstein originally intended it to be. But yeah, it is truly something else. So, Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus by Ludwig Wittgenstein. Have you read the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus? Did you understand the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus? If you have, let me know down in the comments what you thought about it. Whether you think I have misrepresented anything of it here today, whether I misunderstood anything, feel free to correct me if you think so. And as always, if you have enjoyed anything you've seen or heard here today, remember to hit that like button and subscribe. I would really appreciate it. And until next time, peace.